Post-World War II, the Soviet Union sealed off itself and its dependent Eastern and Central European allies from any contact with the West, politically, militarily, and ideologically. And this isolation was termed the Iron Curtain. But were these countries from Eastern and Central Europe really allies of the Soviet Union? Or was it a forced relationship imposed by the Soviet Union? Welcome to The Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we will look at some key uprisings in some of these paths behind the Iron Curtain against their master, the Soviet Union. Soon after the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953, East Germany erupted in a series of workers' riots and demonstrations that threatened the very existence of the communist regime. This happened in June of 1953, and it was entirely spontaneous, but it shocked the ruling Socialist Unity Party and its sponsors in the Soviet Union. The roots of the 1953 East German uprising date back to July of 1952, when the ruling Socialist Unity Party of Germany adopted a crash socialization and collectivization program, which was termed the planned construction of socialism. Now, collectivization, as I had mentioned in one of my previous episodes, was the concept started by Stalin in the Soviet Union, which forced the peasantry to give up their individual farms and join large collective farms. The primary aim of this was political, in the sense that Stalin wanted to reduce the economic power of the kulaks, or the prosperous peasants. But Stalin thought that collectivization would also help him industrialize Soviet Union much more rapidly than normal. And in July of 1952, the East German Communist Party decided to adopt this strategy of Joseph Stalin. And just like in the Soviet Union, this policy had devastating economic effects in East Germany. And towards the end of 1952, officials in East Germany started receiving a growing number of reports on economic dislocations and popular unrest. And the hardest hit in this economic crisis were the middle class, small entrepreneurs, and the wealthy kulaks. But after the death of Stalin, in April of 1953, Soviet authorities tried to rein in the Albrecht regime in East Germany, and they persuaded Albrecht to relax or discontinue parts of his socialist movement and initiate a new campaign called the New Course. There were three major thrusts of the New Course, which was the improvement of consumer goods, the end of terror, and a relaxation of ideological standards. Moscow was trying to quell the unrest in its satellite states by letting go of some elements of authoritarianism that were the hallmark during the Stalin regime. This change in direction shocked many East Germans in and outside of the Socialist Unity Party of Germany. It created widespread panic within the party, and many party members felt betrayed, and they even felt that the change to the socialization program was a result of the pressure exerted by West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer. Now, in the new course, one element of the socialist program was left intact, and this was the increase in work quotas on a compulsory basis by 10% across all state-owned factories. So the workers had to work 10% extra to boost productivity so the economic downturn could be reversed. But at the same time, the government also increased prices for food, healthcare, and public transportation. So combining the increase in work quotas by 10% and the price increase, the net impact on the average worker was a 33% monthly wage cut. And this ultimately became the trigger for a series of strikes and protests across East Berlin and the rest of East Germany. Several construction site workers clashed with union and party officials, instituting work slowdowns and protests. On the 12th of June 1953, about 6 transport company workers started a demonstration in front of the Brandenburg prison, and by the end, some 5,000 people had joined in. Gradually, workers in construction sites around East Berlin started going on strike to protest the increase in work quotas. By Monday, the 15th of June, the protests had become more visible, and workers at one of the construction sites decided to send a delegation to Prime Minister Otto Grotewohl to deliver a petition to resign the increase in the working quotas. But on the advice of his aides, Grotewohl refused to act on those demands. By the morning of 16th of June, the protests became more widespread within East Berlin, and workers started contacting other sites across the city to collect more protesters and march towards the city center. Now, the core theme no longer was socio-economic change, but it was also talking about political change. At this time, protesters were going around the city calling for a general strike. The protesters marched towards the East German House of Ministries and demanded an audience with Party General Secretary Ulbricht and Prime Minister Grotewohl. But that was not granted, and the Heavy Industries Minister sent to calm the crowd was unable to do so. 17th of June was the most pivotal day in these protests. By now, the news of the events in East Berlin had spread to rest of East Germany, and the first batch of Soviet troops had started collecting on the outskirts of the city by the early morning of 17th of June. Yes, just like the Socialist Unity Party of Germany, the Soviets too were completely surprised by the widespread nature of the protests. And they asked the commander of the Soviet occupation forces to start mustering his troops to quell the rebellion. As the day progressed, crowds started pouring in from all the East Berlin districts and surrounding suburbs into the city center. Loudspeaker cars and bicycles were providing the necessary communication between the various columns of the marchers as these columns started converging onto the city center. And besides the change in the socio-economic conditions, one of the key messages being displayed on the banners and posters was the ask for free all-German elections. Yep, the protesters were asking for the reunification of Germany. But one thing to note here is that the East Germans could visibly see the economic growth, prosperity, and freedom across their next-door neighbor, that is the folks in West Berlin. Hence the demand for free elections and a potential reunification of Germany. By 9 a.m., about 25,000 people had gathered in front of the House of Ministries, and tens of thousands more were en route. Between 10 and 11 a.m., about 100-odd demonstrators managed to storm the government seat. And it is at this point that the Soviet military vehicles made their first appearance inside the city. Their first task was to evacuate the administration to a safe location, and after that, towards the afternoon, they terminated all tram and metro traffic into East Berlin so that no further demonstrators could reach the city center. An hour later, martial law was declared in East Berlin, and it is around this time that Soviet tanks started opening fire on the crowds. Overnight, the Soviets had arrested about 1,800 people. Through the course of this operation, between 20 and 40 people were executed, including Soviet soldiers who refused to obey orders. In all, between 8,000 and 10,000 people were arrested, and more than 1,500 were given sentences, including 2 death penalties. So, in a region where information was so controlled, how were the East Germans able to organize the uprising? Well, the answer lies in a 4-letter acronym, RIAS, RIAS, or the radio in the American sector. The RIAS was a radio and television station in the American sector of Berlin during the Cold War, and its aim was to provide the German population in and around Berlin with news and political reporting. And the East Germans listened to it secretly but diligently. And through the days of the uprising, the RIAS broadcast confirmed the news about the mass demonstrations in the capital, the various demands for free elections, and the demand to rescind the work quotas. The impact of the RIAS during the uprising is best captured in the comment made by Soviet High Commissioner Vladimir Semyonov during a meeting with the East German political leaders, where he stated that the RIAS is broadcasting that there is no government anymore in East Germany. And he followed that up with, well, that's almost true. Long before the Arab Spring, Czechoslovakia witnessed the Prague Spring in spring of 1968. The Prague Spring was a brief period of economic and political liberalization in Czechoslovakia under Alexander Dubček between January and August of 1968. Post-World War II, Czechoslovakia became a satellite state of the Soviet Union, and it was also a member of the Warsaw Pact alliance. And just like East Germany, it was following the collectivization form of agriculture. But by the 1960s, it was clear that the model was not working, and the results were clear in the poor state of the economy. Most importantly, though, the younger generation had gotten tired of the restrictions to personal freedom, and it was also frustrated by the low standard of living. So in 1967, students took to the streets demanding more light, and the Communist Party, feeling challenged, sent the police to brutalize the students. However, during the session of the Central Committee in October of 1967, Czechoslovakia's communist leader, Antonin Novotny, clashed with the other committee members. Subsequently, he tried to invite the Soviets to help him regain control, but they declined. He ended up resigning in January of 1968 and was succeeded by Alexander Dubček, who was elected unanimously. Now, under Dubček, the proponents of economic and political reform started gaining the upper hand, and in April of 1968, an action program was adopted by the party's Central Committee. The program proposed industrial and agricultural reforms, a revised constitution that would guarantee civil rights, and the complete rehabilitation of all citizens whose rights had been infringed in the past. The action program went a step further with respect to establishment of democratic norms. Per the program, the National Assembly, not the Communist Party, would be in control of the government. The courts were to become independent and act as arbiters between the legislative and the executive branches. To neutral observers, Dubček was offering socialism with a human face. Now, with all these reforms, the democratic mindset that had been suppressed for so long suddenly came alive in Czechoslovakia. Former political prisoners founded a group named K231, which was named after the article of the criminal code under which they had been sentenced. Other intellectuals formed CAN, a club for committed non-Communist Party members. And there were efforts even to re-establish the Social Democratic Party, which had been forced to join the Communist Party in 1948. Christian churches, national minority associations, human rights groups, and other societies suddenly became active. And in June of 1968, dissident writer Ludwig Vasulik published the 2000 Words Manifesto, which urged mass action to demand real democracy. Now, Alexander Dubček was shocked by these developments, but he was convinced that he could control the gradual transformation of Czechoslovakia. But the Soviet Union and other communist nations in the Eastern Bloc were totally alarmed. Now, Dubček did not have any plans of withdrawing from the Warsaw Pact, and he felt that as long as he was towing the Soviet line with respect to foreign policy, he had flexibility with respect to how he was dealing with things at home. The Soviets, though, were not impressed. In fact, the Soviets were more interested in what was happening at home, and there was some leeway on foreign policy. So on August the 20th, 1968, several 100,000 Soviet, Polish, Hungarian, and Bulgarian troops invaded Czechoslovakia. This was a Warsaw Pact invasion on one of its own members. Interestingly, though, East Germany was pulled out of the invasion at the last minute because the Soviets realized that the image of Germans invading Czechoslovakia would be similar to the 1939 invasion of Czechoslovakia by Nazi Germany. There was very little armed resistance to the invasion, but about 100-odd protesters were killed by the advancing troops. Alexander Dubček was arrested and flown to Moscow. He returned on August the 27th, and he fought back tears as he addressed Czechoslovakia, saying, "We hope that you will trust us, even though we might be forced to take some temporary measures that limit democracy and freedom of opinion." Dubček was forced to sign the Moscow Protocol by the Soviets, which invalidated the existing government and put the hardliners back in power. Alexander Dubček was gradually relegated to the background, and Gustav Husak took over as the new leader and stayed in power till 1989. The Soviet invasion on Czechoslovakia was condemned by the West, but interestingly, by a lot of other communist nations as well. Nations like China, Yugoslavia, and Romania came out in open support for Czechoslovakia. The US response, though, was a little muted, with President Lyndon Johnson just cancelling a summit meeting with Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev. And the primary reason was that the US did not want to provoke the Soviets into a nuclear war. And also, there were a lot of negotiations going on around Vietnam and arms control. But from Czechoslovakia's perspective, the Prague Spring was officially over by the end of August of 1968. The Soviets, on their end, marked the suppression of the democratic movement in Czechoslovakia and preservation of communism as one of their major Cold War victories. And it is on that note that we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. What countries are facing the highest rates of inflation currently? With an average annual inflation rate of about 150% across the three, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, and Argentina are the top 3 nations with the highest rate of inflation currently? So the answer is C, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, and Argentina. Question for the current episode. What triggered the construction of the Berlin Wall? That is, what was the problem that forced East Germany to start the construction of the Berlin Wall? Was it A, democratic propaganda from the West, B, significant loss of skilled East German labor to the West, C, influx of West German spies into East Berlin, or D, security concerns with an open border with West Berlin? Once again, what issue triggered the construction of the Berlin Wall? A, democratic propaganda from the West, B, significant loss of skilled East German labor to the West, C, influx of West German spies into East Berlin, or D, security concerns with an open border with West Berlin? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in the current episode. In the next episode, we take a deep dive into the Great War. Yep, we'll talk about World War I, its origins, the details, and how it ended. And all this is most likely going to spill multiple episodes. Until then, stay safe and keep exploring the why in history.